Good morning, friends. I'm grateful to be with you today. Thanks for joining in. So, I have to admit that when I saw the gospel reading for this week, my first reaction was, you've got to be kidding me. Even now, given the circumstances, it feels almost cruel to sit down and preach a sermon about taking up our crosses, denying ourselves, and losing our lives. I know that many of you who are listening this morning already feel like you're losing your lives, or at least your sanity. Maybe you've spent the past week trying to keep your wiggly 5-year-old at his desk for Zoom kindergarten, and you can't even wrap your mind around how exhausting the next few months are going to be. Maybe you've had one too many brain-busting conversations with your teenager who feels like every door to her future is closing in her face. Maybe you're horrified by the headlines coming out of Kenosha, Wisconsin, the shooting of Jacob Blake, the murders perpetrated by a gun-wielding 17-year-old, the heartbreaking fact that white supremacy and racial injustice are literally tearing this country apart. Maybe you're overwhelmed by the fires still burning across California, the hurricane wreaking havoc in Louisiana, the death groans of this beautiful planet we still have not learned to respect. Maybe you're battling loneliness, or depression, or anxiety, or illness, as these days of COVID-induced seclusion go on and on. Or maybe you're carrying other burdens, heavy burdens known only to you and to God. In times like these, it's hard to think about taking up a cross. We'd so much rather focus on aspects of the gospel that are soft and soothing. We'd so much rather hunker down, turn inward, give up, look out for ourselves, and choose whatever spiritual path feels coziest and most comfortable. But, speaking to myself first, I want to suggest that this is exactly the pivot we can't make in response to Jesus' words this week. It's the pivot the Apostle Peter makes, and as you heard in the gospel reading just now, it doesn't get him anywhere worth going. Somehow, even during the painful, frightening days we find ourselves in, we have to trust that Jesus' bad news is the good news. You might remember from last Sunday's gospel that this conversation between Jesus and Peter actually starts out well. When Jesus asks the disciples who they think he is, bold, brave Peter steps right up and says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." An A+ answer. No one could have said it better. In response, Jesus blesses Peter and names him the Rock, the foundation of the church. But then the encounter continues and Jesus starts talking. He begins to unpack what messiahship actually looks like. It looks like a cross. It looks like suffering. It looks like standing up for love and truth and justice and mercy, no matter what the cost. It looks like death. It's at this point, of course, that Peter just about loses his mind and starts schooling Jesus, or trying to. And within seconds, he goes from being the rock to becoming a stumbling block, an instrument of Satan. Standing on this side of history as we do, it's easy for us to mock Peter and assume that if we were in his shoes, we'd never bungle the conversation so badly. But the fact is, we in the 21st century are not scandalized by crosses. At St. Mark's, we worship in front of a crucifix every Sunday. We cross ourselves with our hands during the liturgy. Some of us wear tiny replicas of Jesus' death around our necks. But this is decidedly not the context in which Peter and the other disciples encountered the symbols we routinely use as jewelry. For them, the cross had no religious meaning whatsoever. No veneer of holiness, no hint of redemption, and absolutely no connection to God. The cross was purely a state instrument of torture and death. Imagine for a minute if the central symbol of our faith nowadays was an electric chair, or a lethal injection chamber, or a lynching tree. Biblical historians tell us that it was not uncommon for the road to Jerusalem to be lined with crosses in Jesus' day, each one of them bearing a body. Anyone who took the road from their home to the market, or from the market to the temple, or from the temple to a friend's house, would have no choice but to encounter these grim instruments of capital punishment on a regular basis. Imagine what life was like for the people who lived in the shadow of those crosses. Imagine how their hopes would shrivel under the constant threat and terror. Because of course that was the point. The crosses were meant to intimidate. The crosses were the Roman Empire's illustrated sermons, and the message of those sermons was crystal clear. You can have your religion. You can worship whatever you want. But don't forget, even for a minute, who really holds sway over your life. Go to temple if it suits you, call on your God if it makes you feel good, but never, ever mess with the power structures that actually control your world. Don't even think about resisting. If you do, we'll hang you up too. We know that the disciples' great hope was that Jesus would lead them in a military revolution and overthrow their Roman oppressors. Jesus was the one who was supposed to pull down the crosses, not die on one of them. You know the rest of the story. Jesus announces his death. Peter, impassioned as ever, scolds Jesus for his macabre prediction. And Jesus, in what might be the sharpest and most surprising rebuke in all of Scripture, puts Peter in his place with one swift stroke. Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Even now, centuries removed from the context in which Jesus lived and spoke, I shudder at the implications of that rebuke. What was he saying to Peter? What's he saying to us? For starters, I think he was telling Peter to quit compartmentalizing. The disciple had two very clear sets of categories in his head: human things and divine things. Human things apparently included ugly stuff like loss and grief and pain and humiliation, the grit and muck of this world. Divine things, though, were decidedly shinier. Divine things included glory and triumph and invincibility and power. Divine things, for sure, did not include crosses. But Jesus reorders Peter's categories. In rebuking his disciple, Jesus basically says, you don't get it. God is in the hard things, the low things, the scandalous things, the gritty, messy, broken things. God does not hold God's self remote from the worst of this world. Immunity and invincibility are your fantasies, Peter. They have nothing to do with God. God is where the mess is. One temptation as I read this passage about denying myself is to minimize what it asks of me. As in, okay, no problem. I'll deny myself Facebook and chocolates and online shopping. I'll attend more church events each week, even though I'm sick of Zoom and YouTube. My other temptation tends in the opposite direction. It says, I should become so heavenly minded that I'm no earthly good. This is the kind of self-denial that strips life of all pleasure. The single-mindedness that reduces the world to a grim mission field. The self-denial that sees ideology before it sees humanity. The perverted theology that encourages people to stay in abusive relationships and situations. The religion that mistakes austerity for piety. None of this, though, is what Jesus is talking about. Think once again about those crosses that lined the road to Jerusalem. Think about the fundamental passivity those crosses were meant to instill in the people who gazed up at them. And then think about Jesus willingly taking up one of those crosses and saying, I will not stop for you. I will not choose safety at the expense of injustice and evil. I will not save my own skin while you keep killing the people I love. My uncomfortable truth is that I live in such crippling fear of suffering and death that I use up a huge amount of my mental, spiritual, and physical energy each day trying to stave off both. To be fair, contemporary Western culture encourages me to do this. What would Jesus say, I wonder, to the multi-million-dollar industries that invite me to deny my mortality through cosmetics, fashion, leisure, sex, entertainment, real estate, sports cars, and weight loss? What would he say to a culture that glorifies violence but cheapens death? What would he say to a global economy that rapes and pillages the planet instead of stewarding it with tenderness and wisdom? What would he say to a notion of personal liberty that encourages me to insist on my rights while ignoring my civic and spiritual responsibilities? What would Jesus say to my frightened heart that so often prioritizes self-protection over everything else that matters in this life? The cross is not about remaining passive. The cross is not about admitting defeat. The cross is not about opting out. The cross is about shaking things up. The cross is about rattling the system to its core. The cross is about enduring whatever might happen to us when we confront, resist, and protest the injustices we see around us. Here and now, the cross is about saying, it's not enough that my children are safe from police brutality if yours are not. It's not enough that I have clean air to breathe when my neighbors 2 towns over do not. It's not enough that I'll have dinner to eat tonight if you will not. It's not enough that my raced and gendered body feels safe on the streets when yours does not. It's not enough that my zip code grants me privileges while yours does not. It's not enough that I feel welcomed and nourished by the church if you do not. To take up a cross as Jesus did is to stand always in the center of the world's pain. Not just to glance in the general direction of suffering and then sidle away, but to dwell there. Taking up the cross means recognizing Christ crucified in every suffering soul and body we encounter and pouring our energies into alleviating that pain, no matter what it costs us. It means accepting, against all the lies of my culture, that I will die, and following up that courageous acceptance with the most important question I can ask. How shall I spend this brief, singular, God-breathed life? Shall I hoard it in fear or give it away in hope? Shall I, like Peter, push suffering aside at all costs and in doing so, push Jesus aside as well? Or shall I accompany the one I call Savior down the only road that actually leads to resurrection? For those of us who've grown up in the church, the actual scandal and strangeness of Jesus' death has maybe long faded away. But the bottom line is still the same. God died. Jesus willingly took the violence, the contempt, the apathy, and the arrogance of this world and absorbed them into his own body. He resisted the powers, terrifying as they were, and in doing so declared solidarity for all time with those who are abandoned, colonized, oppressed, accused, imprisoned, beaten, mocked, and murdered. He took an instrument of torture and turned it into a vehicle of hospitality and communion for all people everywhere. He loved and he loved and he loved until the end. Jesus rebukes Peter precisely because the temptation the disciple holds out is so alluring, so deceptive, and so insidious. You don't have to do the hard thing. You don't have to take this faith business so seriously. You don't have to engage deeply or take any real risks. You don't have to die. It's true. We don't. There is a spectator version of Christianity out there, and people do live it. But let's not pretend for one moment that it's the version Jesus calls us to. Let's not fool ourselves that standing on the sidelines will grant us immunity or safety or meaning or joy. It won't. On the contrary, it is death and death alone that leads to resurrection. In the same breath with which Jesus predicts the end of his life, he promises its rising. On the third day, I will be raised. Peter doesn't catch that part, and sometimes we don't catch it either. We get tired. We get overwhelmed. We lose hope. But remember, our bedrock is not death. Our bedrock is resurrection. Christianity is not masochism. The cross is not our end goal. The cross is the instrument of solidarity and resistance that carries us from a shallow half-life to the abundant, glorious life of the children of God. The question is not, how badly are we willing to suffer? The question is, how badly, fiercely, urgently do we want to live the resurrection?